Great documentation is interactive. Anyone on your team should be able to pinch, poke, or prod the props in your component without being a programmer. This is where Storybook Controls come in. In this video, I'll show you how to use Storybook Controls to provide interactive UI experiences for the props in your component's stories. I'm your friend Chantastic. Let's dive in. Before we dive into adding controls in our storybook, I want to make sure that you know what they are and have seen a couple of examples. If you're already familiar, feel free to jump over to the next chapter marker. This is a basic storybook installation. Everything here was added from the generator except for this component that I added. If we go into a button component story, we see that controls are part of the add-on panel. Controls are a way to interact with props without code. Here we can toggle this Boolean value. We can use this text input to change the text label. We can use a radio button to change this enum. We even have this really cool interactive color picker if you want to have an unbounded color picker and see how everything responds to the color that you've chosen. Input standard color values if you like, and even change the color function that is used to get that color. Pretty neat. Okay, so that's a quick overview of what controls are inside of a storybook, but how do we add them to our components? To show you that, I have a tiny little story for a tiny little component right here. This is our component definition. It takes children and a level value 1 through 6 to provide a heading component. We have a story file here and a single story called default. Now, our first story just renders out the component statically. There's no dynamism here. It's just rendering out exactly what we put. And we can see that Storybook is actually telling us that this component is not configured to handle controls. To opt into controls, we need to set up this component to use args. So let's do that now. Every story will take args. They're just like props in a React component definition. And just like props, we can spread these args out across our components. So I'll take all of this away now. Close that up. Now, once I've done that, you'll notice that the text that we were using disappeared. So how do we apply args to our stories? Well, it's pretty simple. We're going to use this name. I can actually copy and paste that. And we'll add a property to it called args and define that as an object. Here, I can define children as the text that we were using before. Heading default. Save. And there we go. Just by changing our component story to take and apply args, and then defining those args, we were able to opt in to Storybook Controls. Now, that's the first thing that you need to know. Without args, there's no controls. So make sure that your story definitions are taking args and applying them. Now you'll notice that Storybook does a really good job of inferring the type of UI that's necessary for each prop type. Because the arg that we provided was a string, well, it's going to use a string in the UI for us to edit that value. Now, these args are applied directly to this story. So what happens if we're to add an additional story? Let's copy and paste that and rename this H2 for a heading level 2 example. Click on that story, and we see that we're in the same position that we were before. There's no setup for controls on this component story. Without the definition of args, we don't get controls. But don't worry, there's a couple ways that we can add controls to components universally. If you use a language like TypeScript or a React library like argTypes, you can actually put type annotations inside of your components in a way that Storybook can understand. So let's do that to this component here, the heading component. I'm going to use argTypes in this particular case because this is a JavaScript React component, and then apply those argTypes to my component definition. Heading argTypes equal, and we'll add a argType for level here. For the prop level, we'll use argTypes dot one of, and we'll copy and paste this array to make sure that it is one of these specific values. We'll hit save, and in this case, we do need to refresh Storybook. Now, by adding that type annotation, Storybook was able to determine that we have a level prop and it has a set of values, and it presents that set of values as a select. Now, we can't see any changes because we don't have any children, so let's add a control for that as well. Children prop types dot string. Save that, refresh again, and now we have an opportunity to set the string heading level 4 and change both of these values as we see fit. This is great, and we can see that both of these controls are now available on both of these components without having to define args for both. But what happens in a case where we don't want to add type annotations to our component, or in a case where the inferred UI is not the ideal UI? Well, let's take a look at children. Here in our prop types, I've actually defined this type as a string, but that's actually not accurate because React Children could also be a number, an element, an array of elements, or a mixture of all of those things. So what should it be? Well, if we're looking at prop types definitions, this should be node. But what happens when we change that prop type to node? Let's refresh our component again. We see that children changed from a text input to set object. And when we click it, we get this error. For the purposes of our documentation, we want this to be a string, even though the component definition is more permissive. We can specify exactly which control we'd like to use for all of our stories in a component story file. So let's jump into our story file, and in our default export, add a new field called argTypes. This is an object, and that object is going to look like our props. So here we can do children, provide another object, and for children, use the control text. Hit save, we'll hit refresh, and now we have a set string option. That means that in these story files, we'll be guaranteed to have this text UI, even though the component itself is much more permissive in the way that it's used. Now, to be super thorough, I want to show you that you can do this with levels as well. So let's change this to level. You might prefer for these values to be represented as radios, which we can do. Just like that, we see that the documentation across all of our component stories is updated to show the defined UI as a radio button and text input. Now, we've covered a lot, but this is honestly just the tip of the iceberg of things that you can do with Storybook Controls. So where do you go if you have a more advanced use case? Well, let me show you. First, we start by going to storybookjs.org, clicking on docs, going to this fancy search or hitting Command K and typing in controls. Here you'll find a really comprehensive document on how to apply controls into your component, how to customize them and do all of that fancy stuff that you might need to do. In addition to that, you can change the version and the UI layer. So we have Vue, Angular, and web components that we maintain, and then some community supported frameworks as well. One specific section that I will point out as a long-term resource is the one on annotations. So if we jump down here, you can see there's a really nice table of all of the different types in JavaScript and some of the best control pairings for those, along with some of the more detailed options that you might try using. So that's it for today, a quick and easy tutorial on Storybook Controls. If you have a tutorial that you'd like for me to make, please let me know in the comments below. My goal is to help you become a Storybook Pro. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to hang out with other Storybook enthusiasts, join our Discord. The link is also below. Keep improving the UX of the web, friends. I'll see you in the next one.